This is Lisa Sowle Cahill. I'm here with my friend and colleague at Boston College, James Keenan, who is a Jesuit, a moral theologian, and the author of a wonderful new book on the history of Catholic theological ethics. Welcome to our conversation, and Jim, I'm delighted to be here with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa.
So, I've read this book a couple of times. I've enjoyed it. I've learned a lot from it. It's a long book. It's a hefty book, covers a lot of territory. Did you find that at all hard to pull off?
Yes, it took me about 10 years to write. It took me 10 years to write, but I was a calculated 10 years. I would offer different courses over the past 10 years to different graduate students so that they could get an appreciation of the periods that I was working on. And that way I also had their input and their reactions and began to cultivate, if you will, some of the people that I really wanted to focus in on, some people that I thought really innovated, and also to say that I thought that there was a consistent history that was developing and I wanted to try to identify it. So I use teaching and my students, if you will, in order to develop my argument.
So it covers a lot of territory and is based on many courses, yet there's not a lot of church teaching in it or citations of the popes. Why not?
Well, it's a book on Catholic moral theology, or what we today call Catholic theological ethics. Those are basically interchangeable terms. But, you know, Catholic moral theology, when you think of how it's being taught or how it's been taught, was never really about church teachings per se. It was basically about trying to understand how the church understood the way we were called to be Christians, the way we were to live upright lives. So church teachings are about very particular issues. Moral theology is about living your whole life, or a community living its whole life, or a neighborhood living its whole, or a parish. So there's a certain way that moral theologians, when we teach our course, theological ethics, when we go about teaching it anywhere, is not really about particular teachings all the time. As a matter of fact, it's occasionally just that, because the church intervenes with its teachings every now and then when it feels a need that it has to make things clear. So it's really to try to get in, what is the life of the Christian? What is the expected life of a baptized Christian in order to respond to the call of Christ? And so that's what it's about, moral theology.
So when we think about church traditions in general, whether theological or pastoral, practical, existential. And when we think especially of moral theology, I think our mind tends to go toward consistency and patterns and continuity. But in this book, you talk a lot about innovators and innovations. And of course, innovations in a tradition can be good or bad. So who were the heroic innovators, or those that you see really setting important benchmarks for how the tradition comes along?
So this Abelard comes out. He does a book called Sic et Non. This is a book in which he lists 153 different teachings of the church that have a yes and a no answer for each one of them. And he tries to show that, as a matter of fact, we haven't resolved 153 questions. And scholasticism is actually, I think, a response to Abelard's great work. Thomas Aquinas will be showing that there's a debate on each of the questions that he's working on. So there's a certain way that he poses at the University of Paris, the Sic et Non, and that actually helps to be the generator of it. But then another innovator is Eloise herself. If we're only discovering now, in the past 25 years, Betty Radice and others are doing these works on Eloise's way, that how did she understand Abelard? How did she communicate with him? What were her ideas? What was her leadership role in the communities that she ran? And she actually emerges as a better exponent of what Abelard is looking for than Abelard himself. So she emerges as an innovator. Two other innovators that later on that I find really compelling is Vittoria. I can't get over Francisco Vittoria. Vittoria is a Dominican. He's at the School of Salamanca. He's getting reports from the early Dominicans who are involved in the conquest of the New World. They're ministering to people. They're shocked at the way that the different Spanish and Portuguese soldiers are acting, the way they're treating they're just appalled by this. And he begins to articulate what we could call today international law. Trying to talk about what are the rights of Native peoples. And no one had done anything like that, but he's doing it literally as he's getting the reports from his brother Dominicans. And he's actually the foundation to what we have now, for instance, in talking about human rights, international human rights or international law. He's the founder of it. I find him compelling. The last one I find really compelling is, I think, a role model for theological ethicists, and that was Alphonsus Liguori. He's a lawyer. He's also a Redemptorist, founder of the Redemptorist. But he does all this great work of working with people who had syphilis, working with people who are on death row, working to create these communities of faith all throughout Naples. He sets up something like 90 different what are called evening chapels, where these poorer, uneducated people become actually leaders of community, trying to help one another to understand what the Christian faith is. That type of moral theologian who's able to write about things is the one who understands the people with whom he or she is working with. I think this is an innovator for our contemporary time.
I noticed that recently in American Magazine, you have an article on mercy and justice. Is that article related to this book, or is that?
I did that article. It came from, I was invited by Georgetown University to give a lecture on my book on the first few centuries. It was about the patristic period. And I decided to focus in on, if you will, how my book builds on the work of Jack Morney, John Mahoney. He goes by Jack now. But Jack Morney did a book called The Making of Moral Theology. This came out in 1987. There hadn't been really a book of its nature before that, and there hasn't been a book since then until my book, I think. But he made an argument in that text that he began the two first chapters of his book. The first one is on the Irish penitentials. These are texts from the 6th to the 9th century about how Irish monks and abbesses heard the confessions of those who were coming to them, most likely members of their community. And he basically tries to say that the history of moral theology is all about confessing sin. And he sees this as a key to understanding that. Then he goes in his second chapter to Augustine, who he says, again, focuses more on sin than anything else. And he does, the reviewers all remarked on this too, that Mahoney's work was basically saying the history of moral theology is the history of confessing sin. Shouldn't we be doing something better? And he's interested in something about the virtues and about the spirit. When I read that, I was just completing doctoral studies, and I thought it was a terrific work, but I was wondering, was it really all about sin? And I wanted to say that as I was studying for my doctorate, and then later on in years, I began to see that the beginning of the church, and even the whole history of the church, was much less about confessing sin and more about doing works of mercy, or being a merciful person, or being a merciful disciple. Let me just explain one thing here. Since Jack did that book in 1987, there have been lots of other works that subsequently came out that he had no access to, that if he had known this, I think he would be saying what I'm saying. That's why I say I think my work builds on his. But for instance, Hugh Connolly did this great study of what were the Irish penitentials. And now what we understand about the Irish penitentials is that it was not a confessor they went to, it was what they called an anam cara, an anam cara. An anam cara was called a soul friend. It would be a senior monk or nun, somebody who was a companion with them. And that it happened in a context not of confession as much as spiritual direction, what we would today call spiritual direction. But this spiritual friend, soul friend, was to help you to get further forward. It was not about addressing simply the problems of the past. That was incorporated into this agenda, but it was not the agenda. The agenda was moving forward. And then I looked at works like by Rodney Stark on the rise of Christianity, Wayne Meeks's great works on the origin of moral theology. And I was looking at others, Peter Brown, who insists that the works of mercy that were not only constantly being provided, but whenever they were provided, they wanted to identify the recipients of those works of mercy as their brothers and sisters. They were being incorporated into community and being recognized as being equal to them and not somebody that they were condescending to. So my argument was basically, yeah, there's a lot on sin, but almost all of the questions on sin are, how do we follow Christ better as a community of faith, trying to be mindful of the inequities in this world in which we live?
Who are you hoping to reach with this work? Like, what's the scope of its impact? Did it have an audience or maybe more than one audience?
Yeah.
Who are you envisioning?
I wrote this for Paulus Press. I wrote it for Paulus Press because I wanted to market it to a Paulus Press audience. I wanted to market to an intelligent reader who is not a specialist in the field. Now, specialists in the field are going to like the book, I hope. But I would say that the basic thing I was thinking of was, I was thinking like Richard McBrien years ago did this big, big book called Catholicism. Lots of people had it on their bookshelf. That's what I want this book to be, on the bookshelf of those Catholics who want to stay up on their faith and to understand better what it means to be a Christian. It has a healthy index. It has a good table of contents. I try to make it very readable, even while I'm going into some of the weeds. But I deliberately wrote it for an audience who wants to know more about the field without having been educated in it.
Mm. And where are you going to go from here? Do you have another project?
Yeah, I just am finishing a project. I gave these lectures over at Oxford, the Darcy lectures. Interestingly enough, Jack Mauney's Making a Moral Theology came out of those Darcy lectures. Mine, I decided to do it on the moral life. And I really enjoyed doing it. I had to do 8 lectures, one a week. It made me really work hard for it. But I wanted to begin with grief. I wanted to begin with the experience of grief, because grief teaches us how deeply connected we are. And one of the problems with moral theology is we keep thinking about the person, and we keep thinking about autonomy. And I think we had to think of ourselves as relational first. And I'd like to say that we know that we're relational, and that thinking of ourselves as individual persons is not really a good starting point. So I use grief, and I use grief for 2 reasons. One is, we had a practice years ago called the Ars Moriendi tradition. It's the art of dying. And it was a belief that if you had an image of what it means to die, what your deathbed experience would be like, you would know how to live, because you'd want to live to that point so that you died the way you wanted to die. You could think of Hamlet holding a skull, saying, "Alas, poor Yorick." It's a way of reminding yourself that you're going to die someday. It's nice, but that's a figment of your imagination. I think grief, the experience of grief, is overwhelming. The experience of grief touches our soul. It touches us as real human beings. I think most of us, whenever we grieve, we're overcome by how close we felt to the person that we lost, about whom we're grieving. So I want to start with the phenomenon that we know in our gut how related we are to one another. And so I reflect on grief, and then I move to chapters like on vulnerability, chapter on recognition, on ways that we're deeply connected and that matters so much as the foundations for the moral life. And I'm doing that with another press that Georgetown is publishing. But I think in many ways that what I've done here with Paulus, I hope leads to people wanting to find out more about the moral life for today.
Well, from what you've said, I'm confident that they will. And as I mentioned before, I've read this book a couple of times. This isn't the first time I've heard you discuss it, but every time I listen, I learn more. And so I know that all those who have been educated and elevated by your comments today will also be eager to read this book and will find in it a wealth of greater understanding about Catholic tradition, but also its meaning for us today. So thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you very much.